Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and privilege to be here. I used to cycle out to remote places like Madingley in my early years. Tonight I came in a taxi, and for the first time ever in my life, I think the taxi driver at the end not only didn't charge me because you'd very kindly paid for the fare, but also asked for a photograph, so that was a first. So that set the evening off to a good start. I reflected about a day ago, too late to do anything about it, that given that I know the other two people who are going to contribute to your series of lectures, and I think probably they will also give a traditional lecture from the front of a room, unaccompanied by extras, that I should have given up the habit of politicians and embraced the habit of a place like the Open University and come with lots of lovely multicoloured slide presentations for you. So I apologise if the sort of thing that the OU does wonderfully well is not being shared with you this evening. And just one last reflection, it's of course really good that we're all gathered here to celebrate what I gather is the 62nd birthday of Adam Ant, which my paper told me was one of the important things about today. My dad was a brewer, as was my granddad actually, and brewed beer for a living. He didn't own a brewery, he just brewed in a brewery. And when we were young, one of the adverts that was part of his world, and I remember and haven't forgotten, was the Heineken advert, which was all about producing a beer that would reach the other parts, the other places that other beers didn't reach. And I think what we're talking about in adult, part-time, lifelong learning is what we do about education so that it reaches the parts that other education may not have reached. I think there's a problem actually with the wording to start with. I think one of the problems, and we've been wrestling with this, I'm wrestling with it with the government who own up also to say it's a problem, is that we are clearly talking about education for adults, so we're talking about education after the school leaving of the compulsory education age. We're talking about education that's part-time, but the phrases like lifetime or lifelong learning may sound a bit oppressive for somebody who A, didn't like learning in the first place, and B, certainly doesn't want to feel that they're locked in. So I don't have Mars bars on me, but anybody who has a really good idea as to a wonderful phrase that we could use and that could become part of the verbal currency will be very welcome. We're really talking about bite-sized learning, like learning that you can cope with wherever you are, whenever you conveniently can, and for as long or as short as is appropriate to you. I'm going to break down what I want to say in 4 sections, and then at the end give you 3 things, having said there were 4 sections, give you 3 things in good sermon style, which might be things that you might just remember about this evening. The first is just to look at part-time adult mature education up till now, very summarily, and Jim, you've sort of quickly painted that backdrop. So please come in. There are some seats at the front. I know you may not have wished to sit at the front, but that's where the seats are. The pattern of post-compulsory education was always a mixture of things. It was obviously potentially possible for people to go to universities, which was fine, and this Augusta University was one of the first in this country. And then there was a growth of colleges. There was the Workers' Education Association. There was provision at the workplace when there were enlightened employers, sometimes the Cadburys or the Rowntrees, who saw that as part of their responsibility, as well as housing and meeting other social needs. The trade unions, as they grew, saw the benefit of education, both, as it were, academic education as well as vocational education for their workers. Cambridgeshire was one of the pioneers of community colleges, which were all-age institutions where people would go and work together. And there were very well-known ones around the country. There's one in my part of South London, Morley College, which provided wonderful reach, particularly for women in many respects, to make sure that education was provided. We've got to be careful, I think, not to assume that what has happened in England is what's happened even elsewhere in the UK in the same way, let alone outside the UK. The pattern is not identical in all countries of the world. To start with, I'm partly Welsh and Scots as well as partly English and Austrian. And the Welsh and Scots bits of me, and I was brought up partly in Wales, reminded me how much education is regarded as a classless benefit to anybody, irrespective of their background or wealth or occupation, at all stages in their life. Education is seen very differently in Scotland and Wales, even today, than it is in England. And it's always regarded as a good thing, and culture and learning and education is encouraged at all stages, no matter whether, when I was at school, that somebody was a coal miner or a steel worker or whatever, it was regarded valuably. And then the university experience, the post-school experience, the post-school learning experience is very different in other countries. I was at the College of Europe for a year in Bruges, and I trained and worked in Brussels and Strasbourg. Many people in France, for example, go to university always in the town or city they were living in. Most people don't go somewhere else. They go down the road. It's much cheaper, and indeed the fees are almost nothing. Sometimes they are nothing. So it isn't a traditional global position that people leave home and go off to a far-flung part of the country in order to do their post-compulsory education. There's then a separate set of traditions which separated academic and vocational, or academic and technical, early. The Germans still do it. Many other continental countries still do that. They may both be regarded as equally education as opposed to education or training. And therefore coming back into those things is easier if you've gone down a road where that's your natural territory from the age of 16, for example. So if you go to a technical high school in Germany, then it may well be appropriate that you continue to do courses which they run as outreach into the car industry in the city or whatever it might be. And learning from home has always been a tradition, but not until relatively recently has it been a tradition that has taken off, and it's really only taken off in a serious way around the world when technology has allowed it to take off. The Open University, when it started nearly 50 years ago, started with everybody getting a little box of goodies delivered by post to their home, and they would, to start with, use the box of goodies, and then they would use the box of goodies in conjunction with the BBC late at night, and they would learn everything in a traditional format. Obviously now that's not what happens. The BBC late at night doesn't have automatically the Open University is the last thing you watch before you fall asleep, or when you are falling asleep. Although there are many OU-BBC joint productions, as I hope you will continue to notice, but it's generally offered remotely and digitally, and at a distance, though of course supported by individuals. So study has changed, and of course there are many more people who study abroad at any level: technical, part-time, full-time, short courses, long courses, not just Erasmus program type years in the middle of university, but education which people opt to take at some stage because they think it'd be better, whether in an English-speaking language like English-speaking country like the States or Canada, or in a country that's predominantly speaking another language, but where they will teach in English sometimes, in Maastricht or in Denmark or other places like that. Last reflection is that there's always been the sort of the dilemma or the choice that's reflected at the top there between what people are seeking to do further continuing part-time adult mature learning for. The perception is that everybody in Cambridge, I assume, the perception outside I haven't gone around to check in opinion survey form, but people will probably presume that everybody coming to Madingley Hall would be here for personal development, it being the sort of place that is clearly rich in people aspiring to do personal development, and that people won't generally be coming here for professional development in order to advance their chance of prospects in their workplace, or get from redundancy back into work, or from unemployment to work. That's clearly not true, that'd be a generalisation. But there will be places like this where there will be more of that, and places where the bulk of people will be going to do post-18 education for work reasons, for career advancement reasons. I'll come back in a minute to some interesting figures, I hope you'll find them interesting, which reflect what's happened as we see it from the Open University. So the dichotomy between education for self-development or education for betterment in prospects remains, and of course people often seek to do both, quite rightfully, and that should be the objective of both too. And as all that's happening, what is the sort of big picture? The big picture is the population of the world is going up significantly. The UK population is going up. The European population is still going up. Life expectancy is going up. Longevity of people is going up. Working lives lengths are going up. The number of different jobs and careers people will follow is going up. My dad did one job effectively. I mean, he actually worked for one employer for 4/5 of his working life, and then shortly for two employers at the end of his life, but in the brewing and allied trades. My older brother, who sadly died too young, was a teacher, and he was a modern languages teacher for all of his working life. My second brother went into an engineering firm based then at Battersea. In the end, he did a second career, which was working for Barclays International, but he only did two careers. And my younger brother did a variety of things, not settling down, as it were, until he was in his 20s, when he started and continued a degree, and then academically flew past all the rest of us, and got a second degree and then a doctorate, and became the boss of the British Psychological Society, which I presume means he must be very eminent and knowledgeable and intelligent. But he has since the age of 27 concentrated on psychology. But that's not going to be the pattern for many people throughout what they consider to be their working lives, either their full-time working lives or their working lives full-time and then more mixed when they may want to have a slightly less full-time activity. And the other three things that, of course, change phenomenally is that there is more travel, and travel is easier. There is more communication, and communication is easier. And therefore there is more digital reach of material, and that is easier. And I just reflected as I was standing on the already filled train from London to Cambridge this evening, which I gather is pretty full every day of the week, and I'd remember that, that literally on my journey here, as well as looking up some websites on the phone, I had communications from a friend who's on holiday in the States, who was sending me pictures of how glamorous he and his friends looked at some West Hollywood event, which was showing off, and some friends who I'd been to see on my way to a wedding in Spain a couple of weeks ago, who were responding to my picture of the lovely British trees in the autumn and saying how wonderful it was and how they'd love to come to Cambridge. So communication, we're in a different world in terms of the ability to communicate and reach people instantaneously. So that's the big picture. I then want to share with you a bit the picture as the Open University contributes to it, because I think it presents some interesting things which may slightly surprise you, and I hope will paint the picture where we are. So the second part of what I want to say is a sort of stock take on how the Open University sees the world, because we're the biggest university in the UK in terms of numbers of students, and by definition all of our students are part-time, apart from some research students. We have obviously do significant research, but otherwise effectively we cater for a part-time audience. Firstly, the figures, which are interesting, and Jim, I'll address the question of what's happening to the figures, as you rightly alluded to when I come to the third part, which is what should we do now, what's the future immediately. So we're the largest university in the UK. We have 175,000 students, or thereabouts, as of this minute, which is 10 times bigger than the average UK university. We're a university for the whole of the UK, with national offices in Edinburgh and Cardiff and Belfast, and an office in Dublin, so we also work in Ireland. We have about 11% ethnic minorities. We have over 20,000 students with disabilities, by far the largest provider of post-school education to people with disabilities. We have 22,000 STEM students, so we're the largest provider of STEM education in Europe currently at the moment. We have nearly 90% of the FTSE companies having sponsored people to come to do courses with us during the time they're at work with the companies. 70% of the people who study with us are at work at the time that they study. 3 in 4 have no previous higher education qualifications. A significant number have no qualifications. They come to us, as they do in many institutes of continuing education or other provision, with not a single exam to their name, and have to start literally on the ground floor in terms of learning to learn and seeing what they like to learn. We still get 90% more or less student satisfaction rate, one of the highest in the country, about 75% research recognised as being worldwide valuable, and some ridiculous figure that goes up every 2 seconds of the number of people who download our material on iTunes. The latest figure was something like 70 million people who download our material on iTunes. That's a small figure compared to some I'm going to share with you in a minute or two. In terms of the numbers, I got a check for myself really to see what our age profile is. The age profile has dropped. So the average age, surprisingly, of an OU student is now 29, much younger than people would have thought. Actually, the interesting thing is full-time, the age profile of full-time students, university students in England certainly, has also dropped. The average age is younger, so 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, very much people not having gap years, going straight from school and so on. But our figures are these. We have about 14,000 24 to 29-year-olds. We have 30,000 30 to 49-year-olds. So that's the biggest cohort, but also that's the biggest age span as well. We have nearly 5,000 50 to 57-year-olds, and we have nearly 3,500 58-plus-year-olds. And obviously people graduate at the OU aged anything from 21 to 91 on a regular basis, as they do at other places that provide like this. And then we've done 2 things in recent years. We have 10 years ago, put our courses online available to anybody who wanted to use them, not necessarily on their way to a degree or certificate or diploma, but through something called Openlearn, which is just celebrating its 10th anniversary. So it's the courses we write for our students, but they are available for anybody. And the figures there are, I think there's currently about 15,000 hours of content in those courses. There are 1,000 free courses. They're free. The first thing is they're free. 1,000 free courses, videos, articles, and games. Everything, as somebody said to me earlier in the week, from bookkeeping to David Bowie in terms of subject material, again, common in all sorts of institutions like this. The content in 10 years has reached 45 million people viewing the Openlearn content, and obviously working with partners with the BBCs and Googles and other people like that. And I was just looking to see the sort of stuff that was popular this year. So not surprisingly, a huge amount of interest in the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, really popular course at home and abroad. A huge amount of interest in the Rosetta spacecraft and the space missions and all those issues, which is very encouraging. Huge amount of interest in something to do with cultural and conflict around the deaths in Paris of the journalist in the Je suis Charlie tragedy. And lots of people coming in for popular culture on Star Wars Day, which I think is in May, although I'm not a Star Wars fan, so other people may know better than me about that. And that has sought to build skills for study and skills for personal development. And then the other thing we've done in the last 3 years, and here I will just, as it were, pull it straight from the site on the phone, is we have created something called Futurelearn, which some of you may have heard of, which is wholly owned by the Open University, but it's an independent organisation, and it works with other partners in the HE sector at home and abroad, and with the private sector. And I just looked up on the train, if you just give me about 10 seconds to recover it, here we go, on the train to see, what the latest number of people who are currently following Futurelearn courses, and what the first courses that they were showing, just as an archetypal example. And the answer is that there are 4,956,225 people as of today in following Futurelearn courses. And the courses that, if you look at the beginning of the online courses, again offered for free: History of Royal Food and Feasting with the University of Reading. I don't know whether they have a particular food interest. Assessment for Learning in STEM Teaching with the National STEM Learning Centre. Begin Programming, Build Your First Mobile Game with the University of Reading. Big Data, Data Visualisation with the Queensland University of Technology. Compassionate Care, Getting It Right with the University of Dundee. English for the Workplace with the British Council. Futurism and Business, Dealing with Complexity with Stellenbosch Business School. Influenza, How the Flu Spreads and Evolves with Lancaster University. Irish Lives in War and Revolution, Exploring Ireland's History 1912 to 1923 with Trinity College Dublin. And Managing My Financial Journey with the Open University. So, I mean, that's just the first 10. I haven't selected them with a motive other than to share with you. So we are now in a world in which there is a huge demand. The picture I always find it most easy to paint for people is it's a bit like a funnel where there's a very wide open end where people can come in with no restriction, and they can come and do an online course in any country in the world, and it can be 3 hours, or it can be 10 hours, or it can be 12 hours. And it's normally free. If you want it to be recognised that you've done it, then you can pay, as it were, for a badge that says I've done it. Futurelearn, I think, charge £100 or something for their courses if people want something to certify they've done them. And then, of course, you can progress on from that. And people who've had no other education can do an access course, they can do an introduction to learning course, and then they can start to go down the funnel to do the more traditional courses, which may be both generalised or specific undergraduate courses for degrees or certificates or diplomas, and then obviously they can go on and do masters and postgraduate studies and so on. And it is expanding so rapidly that Futurelearn is now the third largest, and started about 3 years ago. It's the third largest provider of these in the world. There are 2 American companies who do similar things. But also, it's meant that the Open University, instead of just providing education for people here, is running a huge program of education for teachers in Sub-Saharan Africa, and education for teachers in South Asia, and India in particular, and teaching English to students, again, in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia and in Latin America. And courtesy of these things around the world, it means you can reach the most remote village, in many cases, and give people learning in English, or small groups of people learning about how to teach in the most remote places at the lowest possible cost. Complete transformation, really interesting transformation. Just today, I had a very interesting meeting with the High Commissioner in the UK of Malta, which is currently the country that chairs the Commonwealth for this 2 years, and is about to become the country chairing the EU in January. And they are very interested in hosting in Malta, as it were, the OU Europe, Mediterranean, North African base, not because we need a physical base with an office, but actually so that there is a cultural presence on the southern flank of Europe for the OU that might attract people particularly to come and learn with us. And likewise, I think there is thinking that it won't be very long before probably what we write currently in the UK as our courses, we may have another group of people writing in Africa for African students, and in Latin America for Latin American students, and in Asia for Asian students, so they're culturally appropriate and not, in any way imposed as being sort of a legacy of colonial activity. Third thing I'd like to say, Jim, really is what next? So I've described where we have been, I've described where we are, and you very rightfully pointed out that we are in a time in England, particularly in England, more than the other countries of the UK, of crisis in some ways, or real difficulty for adult continuing education. The figures very simply are these, that since 2006-07, the number of people applying to do part-time adult education in England has dropped by 64%. Has dropped, the annual new entrants number has dropped from about 58,000 to something of the order of 20-something thousand. And we've never had such a drop before. And the drop has been caused by the fact that, and therefore no party can be blamed, and in a way it makes the argument for putting it right easier. There was a decision taken under the Labour government that we couldn't afford to offer loans for people to do a second degree at equivalent or lower level than the first degree. So if you had done modern languages and wanted to do IT, but at a first degree level, you couldn't get finance to do a second degree. And that was imposed across the board. It was relaxed, decisions were taken to relax that during the coalition. But the coalition, of course, introduced fees at a much higher level than Labour had for university education. And the result of that, which nobody foresaw, and Vince Cable didn't foresee it, and David Willits didn't foresee it, was that although actually the numbers of undergraduates coming to full-time education did not go down as was predicted, I mean, my fear was that people I represented in flats on the Oak Kent Road would say, no, thank you, I can't afford to take responsibility of a student loan at 18 or 21,000 pounds. They clearly got the message that you didn't have to pay now, and you'd only have to pay if you weren't over 21,000 later, and if you sat under a tree all your life, you wouldn't ever have to pay back, or if you were ill or caring for people. The people who said, I'm sorry, I can't pay anymore, were the 35-year-old with a partner, a child or two, and parents getting older who they were thinking about, and a mortgage or housing and other responsibilities, who suddenly didn't think they wanted to take on another financial responsibility. So that's where the drop has come. So the coalition was responsible for that. They tried to mitigate the earlier decision of Labour by relaxing the rules on second degrees, and computing and IT and engineering were exempted. And then a second round has been exempted, which are STEM subjects. But the figures are as I've told you. And while undergraduate entrant numbers are creeping up, the others are coming down. And the real crisis or challenge is that the group that's dropped the most are the over 30s, the 30s to 60s. And they are the group with the largest number of people in the workplace. And if you think about it, if Britain is going to have the skills we need, and we keep on being told we don't have all the skills we need, which is why we have to import them, which is why we have immigration, which is what causes that debate. If we're going to be competitive in the world, in a world which has Indian universities producing thousands of graduates in engineering every week, and the Chinese and other countries are really powering their higher education sector, then, and we're going to do it urgently, and let alone if we are going to leave the European Union, though after this morning's High Court judgment, who knows what we're going to do. I always thought that the idea that you could say, give us control back and assume that the courts would never say anything was slightly naive, but there you are. Whatever happens there, the challenge is for Britain to be more competitive and have more skills. Well, you can find the people with skills much more quickly if you go to the existing workforce than you can even in 10 years waiting for people to come out of university to meet the skills gaps. I mean, the answer is there are many more people available who are capable of being reskilled, retrained, either upskilled in their current occupation or retrained. And I'm not just talking about the people in Redcar who were in the steelworks who lost their jobs, who need to start again because there aren't any steelworks, but the people who may want to go back to teaching or go back to nursing in areas where we're short of teachers or nurses or whatever it might be, and people who did jobs which bluntly in 5 years aren't going to be there. I mean, talk to the people in the city, talk to the people in Canary Wharf. They've done extraordinarily worrying studies about the effect of automation and computers and robots. Senior managers in banks, for every 50 currently employed, within 10 years, possibly 5 years, computers will be able to do everything they do. Because computers are following what they do and the decisions that they make, and therefore will be able to replicate that. So this won't just be shedding the people on the production line looking for the snail in the ginger beer bottle. It'll be for people at all levels of management, at all levels of seniority in all levels of industry, and not just in manufacturing. So the challenge is, how do we, as quickly as possible, give people the opportunity to reskill? And so that leads to what we say are the immediate asks, and then the short-term asks, and then I'll just finish with the last section on what I think are the long-term asks and leave you with a couple of thoughts. The immediate asks we have made, and they're common really across the sector, are to the Treasury to firstly change the policy announced by George Osborne, which was to reduce the budget for what's called student opportunity allocation, student opportunity fund, or widening participation. There's a budget to try to bring in people from the groups which don't come to education, both because they're remote geographically or because they are traditionally not people who come, whether because they're from minority communities or people with disability or whatever. And the Chancellor, last Chancellor, said his intention was, because of austerity, we needed to cut that budget by up to 50% by 2020. Nothing has yet been done to reduce it, but everybody had been working on the assumption it would be cut. It's a bit like pupil premium in schools. I mean, it has the same benefit, that it gives you opportunity to support those who otherwise wouldn't be supported. And so we're saying that's not a very clever move, Chancellor. Just think about what you're trying to do. If you're trying to widen participation, if you believe in social mobility, if you want to do what Mrs May said you want to do as a government on the steps, what she said on the steps of Downing Street that she wanted to do in government, then you have to make sure that the money can follow where the people are with the needs. Secondly, it would be really good to announce in the autumn statement, and we're working very hard to persuade the Chancellor, to say that as from next year there will be no barrier to people having a loan for a second degree if they want one, in any subject. If, Chancellor, you can't afford to do that, because obviously the government have to give the loans, although they get back at least 75% of them, is the calculation, then at least do it for people who want part-time study, i.e. people in work, who will most quickly repay you the cost of the loan because they're paying their taxes and they will be upskilling, and there is clear evidence that the more skilled the workforce you have, the better productivity you have. And interestingly, even people who are looking for engineers and scientists and so on don't necessarily say the only people they need are people who've done degrees, first degrees in engineering and science. The discipline of good learning and good mental approaches can be transferred sometimes into new disciplines if people want to do that. So second thing, change the rules so that as soon as possible we have no barrier to people doing further learning and getting, not saying government should pay for it, but should give people the loan so that they can get on and do that, and that's not a barrier. Then have a much better careers information, advice and guidance service for adults. Modern technology would allow very simply for us all to have on here something that gave us access to information about any courses, apprenticeships, training, courses here, courses at the Open University, courses at any other institution. Cost, but crucially also could tell us where the skill shortages are in Cambridge or Cambridgeshire or East Anglia or Gateshead or Bridgend or wherever it might be, so that if you want to think, hang on, what else I to be doing that gives me the best chance of, then you have that information too. And fourthly, to create for every adult a personal learning account. Every adult over 18 or over 21, a personal learning and training account, which could be used by yourself, it could be used by you to put your money in, or your parents, or your godparents, or your mentors, or your scholarship givers, or your trade union, or your employer. Or it could be used by government if it wanted to. If we want to retrain the steelworkers of Redcar, then the government could put some money in the kitty. If we want to incentivise people in East Anglia to be teachers, because we're really short of primary school teachers, then there's something that could be done. And other countries in the world which have done this have found it increasingly successful. We tried it in this country under the Labour government, but people found a way of stealing the money, so that wasn't very clever. A bit like people try to do from people's backs. But we've learnt the lesson. I think government doesn't think that's a worry now. The Australians are probably one of the more advanced, and they do it. The Scots actually still have a system. The armed forces have a system in this country. The Austrians, I think, in the EU are the most advanced. But the people who are really selling it, not quite the same as the UK, but have come and wowed people in number 10 Downing Street elsewhere, are the Singaporeans, who now don't just give everybody an account, no matter what age you are, but also they put some money into it from the government as well. And they have, even within a few years, found the benefit to the state is not just that you have many more people learning and things as they go through life, but many fewer people needing to go for help with emotional, mental and physical health problems, because of course they're doing positive and constructive and stimulating things, and they're not sitting at home wondering what to do with life. And therefore there are huge health and welfare benefits. So we think that would be really valuable, and we're working very hard to try to get the government to see the benefit of that. And it doesn't necessarily have to cost them a lot at the beginning. It's not that we're saying government, pay for us all to do extra things, but give us the facility. It would have to be ring-fenced for learning and training, authorised expenditure only, but it could be there for life. And if when you die there's some left, then if it was given by your godparents, then you can that can pass on to your relatives, and if it was given by somebody who was an employer, then they could have it back. I mean, there are ways of dealing with the mechanics of that. The other things that are urgent which would help are allowing Britain, allowing England, and I should have just said that the worsening number of people doing part-time is not nearly as bad in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. They each have different funding systems for undergraduate education. And the Diamond Review has just come out in Wales, commissioned by the Welsh Government. Professor Diamond has just reported, and they make many good recommendations. But firstly, they say that full-time and part-time must be treated absolutely on a par in terms of funding and availability of funds and so on. And secondly, that there should be no restriction on people going back to do second degrees. And I think the government is increasingly looking around at the other countries literally next to us and realising there may be things we can learn without having to look very far to learn them. The other thing that would really help is a system of credit transfer that really works. So whatever qualification you do after school, whether it's a technical qualification, whether it's like my younger brother did when he started a university course and then didn't finish it, and a bit like Cambridge has always done, to be fair, which is one of the few universities where you have a part 1 and a part 2 for most students, undergraduates here, is effectively see learning as being in bite-sized chunks, which you can bank and carry. So you never lose the benefit of what you've done, and you can pick it up. And you can pick it up in the same institution, you can pick it up later, you can pick it up somewhere else. Of course, there has to be a sort of cross-checking, but we do it at the OU all the time because people come to us from having done every sort of course in the world. And we have a process of making sure whether that exempts them from part 1 or year 1 or so on. But a system of credit transfer, and that then worked across the UK and across Europe and internationally, it couldn't be compulsory. You couldn't make Cambridge University take people who'd done 1 year at Plymouth University because Cambridge said, oh, no, university institutional autonomy would prevent it. And I understand that, and you can do academic cross-checking and things. But something that allowed a much bigger flexibility and much bigger ability for people whose life circumstances change, who start doing something and then their health or their family circumstances or their wealth or their need to move to the other end of the world intervenes. And therefore that has to change. So those would help a lot. The future, 4th paragraph and then conclusion. Firstly, there is what I call the Royal Hunt of the Sun dilemma. I don't know, it's one of my favourite plays. Peter Schaeffer, who wrote it, died just recently. It's about the conquest of Peru by the Spanish. Very moving play. I commend it if you've never seen it. And it's both about the destruction of the Inca Empire by the Spanish in the name of Christianity, and then the personal conflict between the General Pizarro and Atahualpa, the Inca king. Very beautiful and very moving and very powerful play. And the issue is, what is education? Who is educated? Who is civilized? The Spaniards saying, we're bringing civilization to you benighted sun worshippers. But the play very wisely fleshes out the question, perhaps the more beautiful, the more respectful, the less material, the less greedy, the more loving, the more supportive civilization was the Inca civilization, not the Christian Spaniards. So there's a question about how we make sure that education isn't corrupting of values of simplicity and core understanding. I mean, there's a whole set of difficult philosophical questions about what you're offering. It's a bit like the sort of Fox TV question in America, which, effectively is a TV station that takes a right-wing view on everything and propagates their message. Then there's what I call the sports club and gym dilemma, which is that I haven't done great studies at this. I am a member of a sports club and I go sometimes to it, play squash and occasionally go to the gym. But by and large, the people who go to sports clubs and gyms are the people who probably are the most healthy anyway. And therefore, how do you make sure that the education outreach reaches those who really need it and who find going into education the most difficult? And there are some people who had a dreadful experience personally and at school, and for whom actually just getting over the first threshold or the second threshold is really difficult. And we need to make sure we're not assuming that the offer is so appealing that people will just walk in without question. We get all the right people. The third is how we really do reach the remote people and communities. Take for random people in other countries, in the native communities in America and Canada and New Zealand and places, and Australia. Actually, distance learning has been very good for them because they have been willing and able to participate in a way that hasn't taken them out of their homelands or territories and has felt culturally appropriate. Small island communities, without being sort of predictably stereotypical, Muslim women in Britain, who may find it more difficult to be able to get out to do learning than other cultural communities for all the reasons that people may know, or other people with multiple disability. I mean, all sorts of obvious categories. So we need to make sure that we think about how learning, if it's going to be the great equalizer, the great raiser up of people's opportunities, how it really is there for everybody, not for the some. There's then the question about how you make sure that what is taught is accurate and truthful. And coming to the last week of an American presidential campaign, where the people doing the fact-checking appear to have come into their own more than in any other period in world history. I gather the score at the moment is Trump 75% untrue, Clinton 25% untrue, oversimplifying, which is dreadful enough. It'd be dreadful enough if they were both 25% untrue, but anyway. But there is a real question, and obviously you try to make sure that what is taught is competent and academically verified and so on. And of course, there are questions about what is truth, and we know that. But there is a real question. The more providers of education you have, and this government's very keen to open up providers, I mean, you have to regulate to make sure that what they're teaching is proper stuff. I mean, there were the scandals in this country when there were lots of language schools basically trying to recruit immigrants to teach them probably very poor English and actually not teach them actually very much at all, sign them on their books so they went in the front door and went out the back door to go and work in McDonald's or whatever it might have been. So there are real issues about how we deal with that in the future. And then the last two issues are what is authentic and appropriate education for the person, for the location, for the community, for the culture, for the language, and all those things. And how we make sure we educate people as to how to continue to learn in different circumstances. So if people are going to live longer, and there will be, for many, more illness and more disability as people get older, and Alzheimer's and dementia, I mean, there are ways in which people can be prepared to enjoy education and educational material right to the end. I'm told that the last sense to go is your hearing, and therefore for many people actually in their dying days in hospices and so on up and down the country, being read to, being reminded of things that go back to their time, like people's homes that are good ones, memory days, recollection, history, oral history, all those things actually give people a much greater quality of life. So we need to make sure people can think ahead to how they can prepare for education right up until the end. So, conclusion, what's the future of part-time and adult and lifelong learning? I think I've said it needs some immediate action by government, it needs some strong campaigning, and Jim and I were talking about this earlier. It needs people to be passionate about it. My favourite book probably of all time happened to be written by somebody who was a member of this Augusta University, namely E.M. Forster, and is Howard's End. And those who know Howard's End know that the theme of Howard's End is only connect the prose and the passion. And I think the way in which we have to reach people is effectively to sell, to promote education as the way of connecting the prose and the passion. It's about, on the one hand, how to mend the car better, but it's also about how to give people the zeal and the enthusiasm and the excitement to follow their dreams, follow their ambition, follow the thing they really, really want to do. Because people often have got locked into something they really didn't want to do. And the windows have never been opened, and their potential is huge. And they've been trapped for all sorts of reasons, financial and family and other things, in a box where education can open the windows and let the spirit fly. And I think we need to show people that education is the way to do that. The first thing I hope you'll remember is that I hope you will not just be passive recipients and participants in education, but you will be activists in campaigning for better lifelong learning. The ambition should be that our government, always, whatever government in the future, sees post-school education as having a trinity of components. Good undergraduate and postgraduate full-time degrees at universities, and good full-time teaching at colleges, one. Good apprenticeships and technical training for people who want to do that too, but also good lifelong adult part-time learning and training as three. And if we had all those things, we would be a much better equipped country to face all the challenges, personal and collective. So campaigning for the trinity of learning and lobbying the government. And if you want to write to the Chancellor, the autumn statement's on the 23rd of November, and somebody will look at the emails, and the email is on his website, or write to your MP and ask your MP to write to the Chancellor in favour of these things, and I can share with Jim the ask. Secondly is reach the points other education doesn't reach. So we have to keep on thinking about, even in Cambridgeshire, how do we go to find the people for whom it would be a real benefit, who naturally wouldn't come to us. When I was here, in some of my spare time, I did some youth work on the Hills Road, and there were kids on the Arbury Estate and all the other estates who were not going to be in homes where there were many books or much education. And there's it is surprising in UK 2016 how many children start primary school having hardly ever had a conversation at home. I mean, it is really horrifying. And the symbol of that, I'm a chair of a school governors of primary school in Bermondsey, and the symbol of that is how often you see a parent or carer, presumably a parent, taking a child to school with no conversation between the adult and the child, but a conversation between the adult and somebody on the end of a phone. So there is a real issue. We have a lot of white working class boys and girls, as well as people from other faith groups, who actually start very far behind age 5 and therefore find it very difficult. And their ability, I mean, it depends on how good the primary school is and all sorts of other things, inspirational teachers, but there's a big danger that we still have an underclass in education who, by the time they come to school leaving age, actually haven't had anything really awakened and will go off to do other peer groups. So that's the second challenge, which I hope we need to face. And then the last is to make sure that technology is used for its most beneficial purposes to reach people around the world in ways that we now do in Sub-Saharan Africa and India. I mean, there is the most phenomenal opportunity to absolutely change. Not just teach teachers to teach English, but, for example, we have people teaching nutrition and people teaching healthcare and people. And the most wonderful things that are possible, I'll just leave you with this wonderful sort of vision of what's possible. And just 2 examples. It is now possible to be a student here, for all I know, but certainly at the Open University, doing something like engineering. And you can sit in your flat in a council estate in Leeds, and you can be part of a tutorial group which can have access together to the kit in the lab, which is able to conduct the experiments which are only possible in the best labs in the best universities in the country. You can have access literally from your front room. Better than that, it is now possible, and I've seen it happen, to sit in your front room or back room or your scullery in a croft in Outer Hebrides and be part of a group which plans its morning activities together with a tutor support, and in the afternoon are controlling the telescope in Tenerife, which is working out planetary activity for an astrophysics course or an astronomy course. I mean, just the most amazing technological opportunities. And we're now thinking that we may be able to have an online medical school. Of course, you will need some face-to-face training like you do for the courses we run in nursing and teaching and so on. But half of it is theory, and it would be absolutely possible to do a lot of stuff remotely. Not just an online medical school for people in Cambridgeshire, but an online medical school for people in the most remote parts of the world who might benefit from healthcare and medical training and so on. So there is no limit to the possibilities. We just have to ensure that the political leaderships around the world understand them, we harness the technology, and that we make ourselves a learning and education community all throughout our lives. And this is not just seen as an add-on extra for the few, but as a natural course of events for the many. I hope that's helpful.